Hi, morning. So as you know, no food allowed here. Colombia will boot all of us collectively out of the room. Okay, hi folks, morning, evening, and for those of you diehard guys, night. That's not good night as much as hello night. So now this is week 4 of our global classroom on foundations, and it's been really exciting the first 3 weeks. And last week, I don't know if many of you elsewhere followed, we had a most exciting week in New York with finally the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them. And there were so many leaders here, all kind of really kind of unanimously saying this is going to be the best ever. And now what we need to do over the next 15 years to see how and in what way we can effectively kind of programmatically begin to lay that out and actually have success on the ground. And that's where I guess the entire MDP network kind of comes alive. That's really your mission. So you guys, all of you, have your work cut out for the next at least 15 years, if not more. So today I'm really pleased to welcome one of my colleagues, really great Professor Glenn Denning. He's, as many of you know, he is the director of the MDP program here at Columbia University, and many of you others would have seen him in as part of the academic committee and so on. Glenn brings enormous field experience, almost 30 years, which is astounding because he must have started out on the field when he was 10, because he's really young. So that's another thing for you guys to also get started on the field. Don't kind of take up jobs, desk jobs, and become like the rest of the folks kind of pushing paper. Okay, so Glenn is going to talk about global food systems and specifically how SDGs on agriculture relates to other critical ones such as water, infrastructure, urbanization, and so on. So really happy to have Glenn with us. So Glenn. Oh, the chair is back.
I won't sit here yet. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to show a film instead. Yeah. Okay, so good morning and greetings to everybody out there in MDP land. So, as Shiv said, what a lovely day. What a lovely day it was, September 25, last Friday. We all agreed on something. We all agreed to enter this new age that we know by now is called the age of sustainable development, right? You're all familiar with that in all corners of the earth, hopefully, at least as far as this course goes. I don't think there's any part of our world economy or our world system where it applies more than the global food system. And honestly, I don't think truly there are many folks better prepared to tackle the challenges of the global food system in all its complexity as all of you folks here in Colombia and out there around the world, including in China here. So we're looking down at China here, but we're not really. So the SDGs have now basically promised to give us a framework for the next 15 years so that we basically avoid going over the cliff, going beyond our planetary boundaries into the world of Mad Max. So if any of you have seen this film, the latest one in the series, or go back 20 or more years and see the earlier ones, you'll have an idea of what the planet could be like in a world where we don't address sustainable development seriously. So these are the goals in full color, splendor, 17 goals. So everybody says to me, oh, so your goal is number 2, right? End hunger. End hunger. I say, no, well, that's probably where I focused my attention to begin with. But it's incredibly important to look at all the other goals and the various targets and to reflect on how they will influence and be affected by our success or non-success in tackling the challenges of the global food system. So yes, we have 17 goals. Yes, we have one goal on ending hunger. It's a bit more complicated than that. We had one goal on hunger, or we didn't even have one goal. We had one target on hunger in the MDGs, in the Millennium Development Goals. It was MDG 1, Target 1C. And what we said we would do between 2000 and 2015, over the last 15 years, was to halve the proportion of people who suffer from hunger. Okay, a pretty simple, narrow definition of our food system. And pretty much that was it. Now we've moved on to SDG 2, zero hunger, but it's more complicated than that. If you read it out in detail, it's end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition. There should be a comma then, and promote sustainable agriculture. So we got to tackle hunger, food security, nutrition, and agriculture, sustainable agriculture. So it's a big, bulky, complex set of things, even within one of those 17 goals. And if you can read the fine print, you've actually got much better eyes than I have. And I'm not expecting you to read the fine print, but the fine print are 8 targets. So take a look at those 8 targets. A couple of them relate to nutrition, a couple of them relate to agriculture, others relate to the environment, but there are 8 targets. In fact, if you look across the whole SDGs, there are about 62 targets out of 169 that in some way relate, like pretty directly to the global food system. So it's really, it's right there in the SDGs. So what I'm going to do now is get rid of this thing. Press hide. Stop sharing. Where's that? There? Okay. Is give you a short history of the global food system to begin with. I think history is important. In about the next 15 minutes, I'm going to bring you 12,000 years, take you 12,000 years back and bring you to the present. When you think of it, it's been an incredibly, well, it's been an amazing journey. You think 12,000 years ago, it was the dawn of the Neolithic era. It's the Holocene period. Probably, as the climate experts tell you, it's the most pleasant weather we've had in the history of the planet, or at least in a long, long time. Relatively stable climatic conditions. And through those 12,000 years, we saw a flourishing of agriculture. Before then, humans have been around a long time. Before then, they were hunters and gatherers. Around 13,000, 12,000, 10,000 years ago, a lot of them shifted to sedentary agriculture. They started farming. They domesticated their crops and their animals. And so we've had that journey right to the present day. And a lot has happened along the way, especially in the last couple of 100 years, and I would say especially in the last 50 years. So a key to that has been domestication. So domestication is more or less what it sounds like, sort of taming the wild, all right? So what we saw was that in different parts of the planet, independently, we started to see humans taking the food crops and also the animals that they were previously gathering or hunting and actually working out ways to actually farm them. So they could settle down, they could form communities, they could build societies. So this was the start, really, of agriculture. It was very important. You think back 12,000 years ago, the population of the planet, it's very hard, they didn't do census or anything like that, but the best estimates out there suggest that the world's population was around 10 million. 10 million, right? About this little over the size of New York, about half the size of Lagos today. That was the number of people on the planet only 12,000 years ago. We sort of forget that. So there's been this flourishing over the last 12,000 years. It's created a kind of a population explosion. An explosion that was recognized even more than 200 years ago. Thomas Malthus, you've all heard about Malthusian theories. Okay, so Thomas Malthus was very concerned. What he worked out was that the population was increasing, the world's population was increasing exponentially, right? But our food production was growing more geometrically, if at all. It was expanding. And that's really how agriculture developed over much of the last 12,000 years. In fact, really up until about the last 50 years. Increases in production came about by clearing more land and growing more food and just expanding and expanding and expanding. Now, Malthus was kind of worried about that, as probably, it seems pretty obvious now that if we keep expanding, we must hit some kind of a limit. Now, he wasn't, as far as I know, he wasn't even thinking about climate change and the kind of impacts that we were having, in the atmosphere. He was thinking simply about, at some point, I guess, if we keep increasing, we'll run out of land. We'll certainly run out of good land. All right. So he talked of gigantic inevitable famines. He was fearing that these gigantic inevitable famines would stalk the earth and with a mighty blow bring down the populations. So Malthus has been kind of hovering in the background for over 200 years. And in the mid-19th century, around 1840, the Industrial Revolution was just getting going in the UK and starting to move into Europe. And so there was something called urbanization. There was industrialization, there was urbanization. More and more people were coming and forming cities and getting jobs instead of doing farming. Now, one of the implications of that was that it was more difficult for farming to meet the needs of populations, but it was also difficult for farming to be sustainable. Because typically, when you grew everything yourself and you ate everything from your own farm, there was the opportunity to recycle waste and to have your animals and to use the manure and even to recycle human waste and so on, that in ways that could maintain some level of sustainability. But once we moved to cities, it became increasingly difficult to kind of, take the carts out of London out to the fields where the crops were grown. And so this really prompted researchers back then to start thinking about sustainability. So the very sort of earliest research on agricultural sustainability came from a place called Rothamsted Research Station, which is in the south of England. And those experiments started in the 1840s and, believe it or not, continue to this day. Rothamsted has the longest field trial that's ever been undertaken, over 150 years of continuous cropping and research actually to try to understand sustainability. Okay, so that was really the start of kind of more formal agricultural research. It's a process that's been going on for a long time. It also prompted the first thinking about fertilizers, because it was realized that, agriculture is not a closed system. It's an open system. You're taking things out of that system and delivering them somewhere else. So you take food produced on land, take it to the cities, you consume that food, you throw away the waste, and a lot of the nutrients, you get a net movement of nutrients from that land to the cities, and often resulting in pollution and other negative environmental impacts at the site at where that food was being consumed. So awareness of that got people thinking, we need to come up with some ways of producing fertilizers of some kind so we could restore those nutrients. So this was, again, back in the middle of the 19th century, coming up with some kind of commercialization of fertilizer, crushing bones, looking at ways of using manure more effectively, and so on. it also got people thinking about, okay, so what are other sources of nutrient? And so there was a big boom in more or less went from the 1840s to the 1880s, continued into the early part of the 20th century in search of guano. Now, guano are basically bird droppings, all right? And there were these massive resources that had built up, particularly on the islands to the west of Peru and Chile, over thousands of years. Basically, birds, but this was a very fertile part of the Pacific Ocean. So the birds, you know, had a great time eating the fish, and they landed on these islands and did what was necessary. And then thousands of years later, you've got these massive, very concentrated resources of nutrient. So there were the guano wars of the second half of the 19th century. And as you would expect in such a situation, before too long, all those reserves will run down. But before then, you know, you could buy guano from the islands of Peru. You could buy them in the Midwest here in the 1880s. So people had worked out there is value in restoring nutrients. Okay, so that was important, but it was kind of a short-lived. It was a natural resource that had built up over a long time, but it was very quickly exhausted. Now, the next big breakthrough, which many people believe is probably the most significant technical breakthrough in the last 200 years. That's a pretty big statement, but it's right up there. And that was something called the Haber-Bosch process. And so this was a process developed by two German chemists. And what they both won Nobel Prizes, Haber and Bosch. And they worked out a way of capturing nitrogen from the atmosphere, okay, and under pressure, combining it with hydrogen and producing ammonium. So nitrogen from the atmosphere, I mean, the atmosphere is 78% nitrogen. It's the most important nutrient for crops, all right? It is essential for photosynthesis and the like. So this process actually industrialized fertilizer production. And this was, more than anything else, created an incredible boom in production. And it actually created, and many would argue, a boom in population, because people were able to consume larger quantities of food because of the response of that fertilizer. So without going into the chemistry or the biology at all, let's just say nitrogen is essential. Nitrogen is essential for crop production, okay? And various kinds of cereal crops, which constitute the major food crops, the major sources of calories, must have nitrogen. You've got to get it from somewhere. You can exploit it from the soil for so long. You can get it from guano if you can find guano still. But ultimately, you have to find that nitrogen, because every time you take grain away from the field to consume it, you're taking away nitrogen ultimately from the soil. So it's a critically important part of it. So that was looking at sustainability from the point of thinking about nutrients and nutrient management. Then there was genetics. And during roughly that same period, we had huge breakthroughs in genetics. Gregor Mendel, Charles Darwin, the whole idea of inheritance and selection and accumulation of characteristics over time, that was the start of a revolution in being able to manipulate our food crops. Up until that point, you know, I talked about domestication. Domestication was going out there and picking some plants or animals that we liked and bringing it to the homestead, growing it, observing it, maybe picking the one that we like best and collecting that seed and growing it again. This was a process of selection over time. So you accumulated through Darwinian approaches, you basically accumulated the genes that you wanted. Breeding, however, meant you can actually take this characteristic, combine it with this characteristic, put them together, see what comes out. Oh, I like that. It tastes good. It yields a lot. It has a nice color to it. So it wasn't just for food, it was for flowers, it was for dogs, it was for everything. So applying genetics. So In terms of agriculture, the big breakthrough was applying this to corn, which was an important crop in the United States, both for consumption, but also for animal production. And what we saw was a huge takeoff in the first part of the 20th century. So the basic work on hybrid corn started very early in the 1900s. But you can see that by 1940, 100% of the corn grown in the state of Iowa, which was a major corn growing area, 100% of it was hybrid, was already hybrid. So this is combining seed from two different varieties, creating a hybrid. It created something called hybrid vigor. Only the seed, you could only get that vigor when you combined it once. So you had to keep combining it each year, and you had to buy seed each year for that combination to have that hybrid vigor. And it gave you 20 to 30% extra yield for apparently no cost. It was simply the right combination of genes to do that. So it really had a huge impact on production. It had a huge impact on production in its own right, but particularly because it corresponded to the period when fertilizer became available commercially. So you had this combination of growing new varieties of corn. So you got the genetics right, but you also had ways of restoring soil fertility by applying fertilizer. And in fact, hybrid corn, that was the first case in the world that we know of where the private sector actually started to get involved in agriculture. Previously, farmers just grew their seed, kept the bit that they could plant next year, and that was the way it was done. Now, farmers could say, I want this variety, I want that variety, and you'd start to get companies like Pioneer back then competing with each other. Who's got the best seed? And farmers bidding for that seed because they wanted that seed. So that was the start of really of a revolution in agriculture, which had a massive effect on production around the world, particularly during the first part of the 20th century. But what about the tropics? All this was going on mainly in the United States, in Europe. To some extent, it was going on in Japan and China. But in the tropics, what about in the tropical climates? Very little was going on. Nobody was working on rice. Very few people were working on tropical wheat. The temperate wheats didn't work in the tropics. And many other crops were basically neglected. So in order to tackle the problem, you simply couldn't transfer technology from Iowa to India. Okay? There was a belief that, look, we have to develop improved technology locally. So the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and a number of other leaders back then in the 1950s and early 60s decided we needed to establish research centers of excellence around the world. So the International Rice Research was one of the first of those, established in 1960. I spent about almost 20 years there. The key there was to come up with a rice variety that would have high production potential, that would respond to fertilizer, would respond to improved irrigation, and would give you the kind of boost that you were seeing with hybrid corn in the United States. Now, rice actually wasn't hybridized, couldn't be hybridized as easily. It was what we call inbred. So you could improve the variety, stabilize it, and then just use the seed year after year. So that's what happened. So the first variety was IR8. It was a combination of DGO Wujen, which is a Taiwanese variety, short-statured, very sturdy, with Peta, an Indonesian variety, a tall variety, and they came up with IR8. And this was what people described. This was the start of the Green Revolution. In the mid to late 1960s, these varieties, IR8 and various variations of that, spread all over Asia, and to some extent to other parts of the world. And production steadily increased over that time. You can see IR8 coming in, and IR26 and 36 and so on. And this line shows progression in world rice yields. So you had this combination now of varieties that responded to fertilizer that increased production. So this, in one chart, was the Green Revolution, okay? So it was, yes, it was seed, but it was much more than seed. It was combining that seed with fertilizer. It was irrigation. If you could control water, you got much better production outcomes. It was about extension, giving advice to farmers, explaining to them how to produce their rice crops and wheat crops more effectively. It was credit because, okay, fertilizer's fine, but how am I going to pay for it? So lots of governments came in with credit programs. It was building roads so you could get inputs in and outputs out. It was about good policies that supported agriculture, and it was about political leadership. So much so that many of the leaders of that time were elected on a platform of agricultural productivity improvement, the Green Revolution. Don't forget, 70, 80% of the population were farmers. So this was very meaningful to them. And also, it was benefiting the urban consumers, because by increasing production, you've all done enough economics to know that that can drop the price. And that made food more affordable. So William Goud, who was actually the administrator of USAID at the time, he first coined the term the Green Revolution. He said, these and other developments in the field of agriculture contain the makings of a new revolution. He made a speech at the, I think it was the Sheraton Hotel in Washington, D.C. It is not a violent red revolution like that of the Soviets. Remember the Soviets, right? Nor is it a white revolution like that of the Shah of Iran. Do you remember the Shah of Iran? Probably not. I call it the Green Revolution. So 1968, the Green Revolution, the term Green Revolution was founded. So what was the impact? Again, we could talk for days on this, but in one slide, and we will talk for days, by the way. Cereal production more than doubled in Asia between 1970 and 1995. Okay? The population of Asia only increased by 60% over that period. So in a sense, they got ahead of Malthus, right? Malthus was worried, yes, you can increase production, but population will go even faster. But the crop area, the area planted to the crop, the physical land, actually only increased by 4%. So there wasn't a lot of clearing of land. So it changed the whole scale of things. It was intensification mainly of existing land through irrigation, fertilizer, and improved varieties. It led to the commercialization of cereal farming. So people weren't subsistence farmers. They weren't just producing for themselves. They were producing for people in the cities. Wheat and rice became cheaper. So that actually meant their real wage rates went up because they were spending less money on food now. And they could even afford now to diversify into other products, more expensive products. Poverty declined 50 to 18% between the 70s and 2004. Hunger declined from 30 to 16%. All of this a product of this Green Revolution. It was really the foundation of structural transformation, something I'll come back a little later and explain in a bit more detail, and the basis of economic growth, which is often referred to as the Asian miracle. But, of course, there was no free ride, right? There were negatives identified and associated with this. It wasn't all positive. It never is all positive. There were environmental impacts. Now, I mentioned there were very positive environmental impacts in terms of reducing the amount of land clearing. We didn't need as much land to produce that amount of food. We weren't just expanding in order to produce more. But the negative environmental impacts included, in a number of places, overuse of fertilizers, overuse of pesticides, which had both environmental and health issues. Distribution of benefits. You read the Hazel paper, I hope, and you would have seen that initially the larger farmers were the early adopters. But over time, farmers, small-scale farmers, benefited from this technology. It's a very divisible technology. Small amounts of seed can go a long way. Fertilizer can be used at various levels. It's not all or nothing. Okay, so there were issues, but as I mentioned, urban consumers are widely regarded as the major beneficiaries, particularly low-income urban consumers. Yes, there was reliance on external inputs. Private sector, well, as Hazel points out, most of this was driven by the public sector. Particularly in Asia, it was driven by public sector investments in roads, in institutions, in extension and research. Impact on malnutrition, hunger went down, but there were some parts of Asia, particularly South Asia, where malnutrition persisted and indeed persists to this day. Stunting levels are still very high, which is an important point, and that leads us to an important point in that having enough calories doesn't necessarily equate with improved nutrition overall. And of course, there was this issue of, well, there had been no impact in Africa, or very little impact in Africa up to that point. So there it is. It took about 20 minutes or so. That's the history of the world from 12,000 before the present to 2015. I left out a few details, but we'll get to discuss these going forward. So where are we now? Basically, world hunger, the latest report of FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, has basically come up with a number of 795 million people on the planet going hungry. Yes, it's gone down, but eradication is the next goal. Don't forget, SDG 2, end hunger, all right? We haven't ended hunger yet. What you'll see is we haven't done a bad job of achieving the Millennium Development Goal. We will probably more or less achieve it, given the inaccuracy of these statistics. I mean, these statistics, we won't go into that, but it's plus or minus a lot. But it looks as though we've made some real progress in reducing the proportion of people who are going hungry, all right? We haven't reduced the number all that much, but the population has expanded. So the key statistics, there they are. Almost 800 million people still hungry, 2 billion people with micronutrient deficiencies, 159 million people, children, are stunted. 45% of all deaths under 5 are due to malnutrition. Almost 2 billion adults are overweight. 600 million of those are obese. And we waste a third of our food. That's not a particularly good scorecard when you think of it. I mean, it is an amazing achievement that we've gone from 10 million people to 7.3 billion. But there's a bit of wreckage along the way, and there's a lot more to be done. That's why we need the SDGs. So zero hunger, we've said by 2030, we'll end hunger. By 2030, we'll end all forms of malnutrition. Easy, right? No, not easy. Very difficult. Seems impossible, right? So anybody who saw the concert on Saturday night will remember that Bono got up and used this quote from Nelson Mandela. It always seems impossible until it's done. All right? So whether it was slavery, you know, whether it was apartheid, whether it was women's voting, it takes time. Whether we can do it by 2030 is a big question. I wanted to, in the last few minutes, talk about some key transformations taking place in the global food system. I want you to be aware of those transformations. We had a great class here at Columbia on Friday. Many of you were there, where we had our guest speaker, Franny Lotier, talk about the ingredients of leadership. And one of the key ingredients of good leadership was to understand patterns, understand trends, to see what's happening around you and to use those trends. So these are the big five, I'd say, okay? There are demand factors, there are supply factors, and there are mediating factors. Now, I didn't give you this reading, but look it up. It's a great reading. I thought I was giving you too many readings already. Let's go through them one by one very quickly. Urbanization. These are the forces, the driving factors. Urbanization is taking place all over the world, all right? In 1950, 30% of the world's population lived in cities. Okay, in 2015, 54% of the world's population live in cities. In 2050, 66% of the world's population will live in cities. So urbanization, this means more people are depending on fewer people out there in the rural areas to produce their food. Changing dietary patterns. Say no more. If you can see this photograph, okay, more food, more fat, more sugary drinks, more processed food, more meat, changing diets all over the world, okay, including in China. Look at all that meat growing over on the side. Not as much yet as the Americans or the Europeans or the Australians, need I say, but it's there. And it has all kinds of consequences, okay? It has consequences on health. It has some positive consequences. It's actually useful in many societies, and many societies need to increase their, or would benefit from increases in animal product consumption. But for many other parts of the world, we're consuming way too much. So that links us to goal number 3. And I'm just giving this one example. I want you to go through every one of the 17 goals and see the other 16 and see how they connect to the food system. So by 2030, we're going to reduce by 1/3 premature mortality from non-communicable diseases through prevention and treatment. It's a bit of a wimpy target, actually. I was really quite disappointed they aren't more directly talking about overweight and obesity. The Global Nutrition Report came out last week. It basically looks at countries and their progress towards improving nutrition. You know how many countries have managed to reverse the trend towards overnutrition out of the 160 or so that they monitored? A big 0. Not one country on the planet has yet managed to reverse the trend towards overweight and obesity. So let me go to the third, and that is essentially the mediation, if you like, the supply chain, the retail revolution. Globalization is occurring. There's no question about that. We can talk about it, we can complain about it, but it's happening, right? So this particular graph looks at Africa's food imports and export trends. Unfortunately, imports are getting away from exports. So they're importing a lot more food than they're exporting. Both are going up. So trade is increasing all over the world. You can get Brazilian chickens in Mozambique in the marketplace, okay? You can get quinoa from Peru in New York. I had some yesterday. You can get teff from Ethiopia now in parts of the States. So it's happening. Globalization is affecting our food system. Supermarkets, this is really a relatively new phenomenon. And I'm not talking about the big Walmarts or even Uchumi here, but it's happening all over the world. Supermarkets, various kinds of stores that integrate the supply system, that often bring food from large distances to get onto the shelves, that often involve a lot of processing, a lot of preservation, a lot of packaging. It's having big impacts on what we consume, and it's having big impacts on what we waste. Factors of production, there are many factors of production, but I just wanted to mention one of these. A hot issue is land. Okay, since 2000, there have been 38 million hectares of land transactions, large land transactions around the world, the so-called land grab or agro-investing, whichever way you want to put it. But it's happening, 1,340 deals. So what are the consequences of that? What are the consequences on food security, on nutrition, on communities, on environment? We don't quite know, but there's a lot happening in that area. So this is one of the big trends. Technology, new varieties, new techniques, more precise breeding, going beyond what Charles Darwin and Mendel talked about to actually being able to manipulate, to understand the genomes of products, of commodities, of crops, of non-crops, and seeing how those could be manipulated through modern science. Yes, GMOs, all right? This is not a GMO. This is orange flesh sweet potato. This is a traditional food in some parts of the world, but not in Africa. But it is now. Not a traditional food, but neither was corn. Corn came from the Americas as well. But it's now being spread. It has high levels of beta-carotene, improves vitamin A consumption. So improvements in varieties. Now, this is not a GMO, but what does it matter? If it can improve nutrition, we need to be looking at ways of supporting it. Now, this is a GMO. This is golden rice. Most rice is white, right? It's brown if you don't polish it. But most rice is white, and it doesn't have beta-carotene. There is no beta-carotene naturally in any rice variety in the world. And we know, we've looked at 140,000 rice varieties around the world. The only way you can have golden rice is to transfer genes from other organisms. Initially, from daffodils, also now from corn. But this means that people, potentially it means that people who mainly get their food from rice, mainly get their nutrition from rice, which has very little going for it other than calories. My friends at IRI will complain about that statement, but it's still important. But getting beta carotene is extremely important. And high-tech tools. And Sweta will explain to you how she's using or was using drones in East Africa, but basically how we're using satellite technology now to improve the precision of input applications. So that's it, basically. That's my story. I mean, that's 5 big trends taking place. What's the answer? Okay, I'll give you 4 pillars of an approach that I think would enable us to move towards a more sustainable global food system. I think we still need to improve productivity. Yes, we need to improve production, but productivity, input use efficiency, to do it in a climate smart way, to do it in a world where climate change is happening, where we have all kinds of new shocks installed. Improving distribution and access. Okay, infrastructure, physical infrastructure, being able to move food around from excess areas, excess production to deficit areas. We see many parts of the world where people are going hungry almost, in the same country that people can't get rid of their food, can't get rid of their crops. So improved access. And this means social welfare systems as well. People who don't have access, not because of physical access, but because of incomes, because of poverty. Reducing food waste and food losses. I've said many times, 30%. You don't just lose the food, you lose everything that goes into it. The nutrients, the water, the land that was used, the deforestation that occurred, all of that is lost when you throw whatever you didn't eat in the trash can. And shifting to healthier diets, okay? So there we have, in all its glory, the colorful Sustainable Development Goals. As I said, go through all 17 and look at the connections to the food system. As Pope Francis said, solemn commitments are not enough. Yes, he believes in people and planet, but we have to make sure as the dust settles on New York that we keep everybody accountable for the various promises that were made, because we don't want a red revolution, the kind that William Goud talked about. We saw glimpses of this back in 2008 with high food prices. We don't want a brown revolution of the type that you can see in the Mad Max film, where we've run out of water and fuel and things get really nasty. Or to bring it a little bit more up to date, if you watch the new Martian film, I haven't seen that yet, but it's not really a revolution, it's a devolution. We really have to decide what kind of a future we want. And maybe for the first time today, I'm unveiling what I'm calling a rainbow revolution. Now, before you accuse me of plagiarism, I will admit early that the first time I heard this was in a speech that Kofi Annan gave in Addis Ababa in 2004, the 5th of July, 2004, at the launch of the African Green Revolution. Yes, we still called it the African Green Revolution, but Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General, included in his speech reference to the need for a different kind of revolution, and he said, he referred to a rainbow revolution. Now, why rainbow revolution? Because there was a need to be more inclusive. We needed to value diversity. It wasn't just about 1 or 2 crops. It was about crops. It was about livestock. It was about fish. It was a blue revolution, a red revolution, a green revolution. It was all of these things sort of in the context of Africa that needed to be sort of woven together in a tapestry that included women, that were sort of a major force for agriculture and the food system in Africa, from consumption all the way back to production, and that different approaches were needed. And I think that's very relevant to the world today, and not just in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, as we try to work towards a more sustainable food system going forward. I think the paradigm of a rainbow revolution of some kind might be worth exploring. So I'm going to leave it at that and hopefully get to as many questions. I'm going to give rapid fire answers. If I start rambling on questions, Shiv, cut me off. Okay? Thank you. China's still there. Right. Okay. I hope they're easy. So, number one, from UF Grace. Select. In developing countries, Tanzania, food production is done by small-scale farmers with limited size of land, while big arable land is owned by big commercial farmers producing cash crops only. What can be done to increase food production? Okay, Grace and the other 10 people who asked that question or supported that question. I mean, the issue is that we depend a lot on smallholder agriculture and family farming. There are as many as 500 million family farms around the world, involving at least 2 billion people. The problem in many parts of the world, and a particular problem in Africa, is that small-scale farmers have not been given access to the technology and the resources that they need and the infrastructure that they need to improve productivity. Yields of corn in Africa, on average, are about just a little over 1 ton per hectare. In Iowa, it's been 10 tons per hectare for more than a decade. So you've got a sort of a 10-fold difference there. But even in Asia, it's 3 tons per hectare. So what's the difference? Essentially, I look at Tanzania and I look at Africa more broadly. I see it as agriculture being a large extractive industry. It's been treated like an extractive industry. We've just been mining the nutrients and then moving on to the next place. Subsistence agriculture has been largely about that. And then in places like Tanzania, we've started to bump up against our limits. We can't keep removing the Miombo woodlands, right? So we're degrading the land that we're on. So it involves, I think, a different kind of a green revolution for Africa. I think it still requires replenishing nutrients. It requires improving varieties that are well adapted to Africa. But very importantly, it involves improving infrastructure, the physical infrastructure needed to encourage farmers to produce more. Okay, so that's a very simple answer, but I think there's a lot that can be done. I actually have said for many years, I think Africa could actually become a food bowl of the world. It's the last resource where we have still very big gaps in terms of productivity potential. Thanks for that question. Okay, next question from Kwamel Hanks. Some studies are showing that produce from large industrialized farms tend to have less nutritional value. How can we be sure to not only increase food production, but also to save the nutritional content of what we are eating? Well, you know, I think that's true to some extent. Large industrial farms, at least as we visualize them, we think about corn, we think about soybeans, we think about it in the United States, in the Midwest, we think about Brazil and Argentina. There's been a huge expansion of production. But you know what? A lot of that is going into livestock industries. I believe something like 2/3 of the land on the planet that's used for agriculture, which is 38% of the terrestrial area, about 2/3 of that actually goes into producing either animals directly or feed for animals. So, you know, in some ways you could argue that, you know, at least for some people, that would actually improve their nutrition in terms of having denser nutrient products, animal products, dairy products and the like. You know, but on the other hand, I would say that it's also contributing to a very low price of calories, of carbohydrates. And that's why you're seeing a lot of those products finding their way into the food system. And we see it here in New York and pretty much everywhere else. So yeah, the price of food is lower, and that's often associated with industrial agriculture. But why can't industrial agriculture, if what that means is larger scale, that can also produce food that's has greater nutritional value? It really depends on demand. If we're demanding food of higher quality, presumably we can get that higher quality. Right now, our consumers around the world are demanding animal products, and particularly, I would say, China. But a lot of the growing economies of the world are asking for more meat. They're asking for more beef. They're asking for more chicken. They're asking for more dairy products. And farmers are responding. If you're a farmer, you respond to the market. I'll give you one example. Uruguay, a place that I've spent a little bit of time, in 10 years ago, it produced almost no soybeans, 10,000 hectares of soybeans. Now it produces a million hectares of soybeans. It's mostly going to China, some of it to Europe, but it's feeding the appetite of consumers who are looking not to eat tofu, unfortunately. They're looking to eat meat, all right? So it's a big issue. It's an issue that, honestly, we hadn't thought a lot about until fairly recently, but we're now starting to see the impacts of that both on human health and on the environment. Because again, animal production, directly and indirectly, is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so it's okay to say that industrialized agriculture is to blame, but industrialized agriculture is responding to demand. Until such time we put a halt on that demand, and I don't think we're going to legislate it, although I think there would be some scope for legislation to at least tax in some way these food products that are unhealthy. Right now, we wouldn't even talk about it here in America. It's just, you can't increase taxes on anything, even sodas and things like that. Nobody wants to do that. But really, down the road, if that's, if we want to slow down the demand, we have to do it. The other is to invest in making and developing new food products that are healthier, all right? And if we do that, and if we reduce the cost of those healthier food items, then perhaps farmers can get behind it and produce things a little differently. So thanks for that question. Let's go to the next one. So this is from Julie Nelson. Considering the great rate of world population growth, how exactly genetically modified crops is sustainable in the long run? Aren't we running towards greater health issues and agricultural pressures on the environment? Well, I detect a little inconsistency there, because I guess that, first of all, you're absolutely right that world population is continuing to grow, and incomes are growing. And that relates to what I just described a few minutes ago, and that people's diets are changing and people's demands are changing. They don't just want to have a bowl of rice and a few vegetables. There's a big group down there or up there in China that their incomes have been rising very rapidly, and they're looking to changing their diets. And that includes, as I said, increased consumption of animal products. Now, I think it's a separate issue, the issue of genetically modified crops. The question is, how do we produce what we need to produce for a healthy and sustainable food system? That's the question, right? So what options do we have out there? Business as usual is not working very well, okay? Business as usual is heading us over the cliff, right? So what can we do to improve the efficiency of production? So we're improving our water use, our nutrient use. How do we make sure that some of our food products have the nutritional value that we value that are good for human health? How can we develop systems of agriculture that perhaps require a less demanding and less likely to create an impact on soil erosion, for example? How do we intensify production without expanding the land area? Now, you hopefully all read the Foley paper, and one of their strong points there was really we should stop the deforestation right now and focus on the land that we currently have under production and see what we can do to improve productivity. I strongly believe that all options should be on the table, including biotechnology, including genetic modification. If you choose not to go down that route, and in fact, I will go on a little longer here. On Friday, I had a session. I was moderating a session with the Italian Minister of Agriculture. A couple of you might have been there. And I thought, this will be fun. I know the attitude of Europe to GMOs. So I included some statements on the potential for genetically modified, within the context of making the best use of science and technology. GMOs had a role to play. He gave a very interesting and rational, I thought, rational response. He said, in Italy, we have a food system that has a history of high quality, of natural products, of purity, et cetera, that we want to preserve. And if we accept GMOs, that really threatens that brand, that image in relation, to the consumers. They won't like, mozzarella cheese that's produced in a way that somehow has a GMO associated with it. So it had nothing to do about health, had nothing to do about the environment. It was all about economics. And Chipotle and all these other Ben and Jerry's, all these characters that are out there, with their flags, GMO free and all this, it's 100% about that. 100% about. The science is clear. There is no evidence of health risks. There is some evidence, like all agriculture, of environmental damage. Traditional agriculture, subsistence farming, is the most damaging agricultural system on the planet. But by and large, there's no additional damage brought about by the use of GMOs environmentally. So take that off the table. You can leave the issue, if you want to, think through the issue of control of the food system, the role of businesses, multinationals. That's fine. Keep that separate. That's another issue. And that's very contextual. We need to discuss. Okay, now let's discuss that issue in relation to the use of GMOs in Iowa or Tanzania or China. Okay? But my point is simply this. If we want to discuss GMOs rationally, we need to understand the evidence behind it. We can have conspiracy theories. I don't really, we have enough of that with Donald Trump and all these characters on television every day. I don't want to go down that route, but let's get the evidence as best we can and then make some rational decisions and discuss it accordingly. Okay, so, in the end, I think GMOs should be a part of the future, but they're no panacea, and they have to be thought as part of that rainbow revolution. Okay, thank you, Judy. We've got that one out of the way. Select. So who we got now? We've got DeWitt. Wow, cool. There he is. Let's see what he's come up with. How do you see commercialization through economies of scale taking place successfully in Africa, where land holdings are small and dominated by smallholders who often account for 70% of the of most countries? Okay, so land consolidation. I didn't go into any sort of detail, but you'll remember I talked about some of the big trends, and one of those is urbanization. Another one is the issue of land as a factor of production. Now, I mentioned land grabs and the like. Again, that can be a bit of a diversion. DeWitt made the point that, across Africa, most of the agriculture is done by small-scale farmers. Now, small-scale farming is fine, provided it meets the requirements of the families who do the farming, right? So if your vision is subsistence, staying alive, there's a certain amount you can do. If your vision is income and is to grow and is to, kind of reduce the inequality that exists out there through your own efforts, you have to modernize. And one way of modernizing includes consolidation of farms and bringing larger farms together. Bringing larger farms improves the potential for you to be able to produce surpluses. It opens up possibilities for reducing the cost of production, particularly with mechanization. Now, mechanization, we rile about mechanization. It's a good thing, right? You've all got, you're not doing long division anymore. You've actually got computers in front of you, right? We've all gone the route of mechanization. Farmers want to go the route of mechanization. Labor is expensive. Their time is expensive. In Africa, it's mostly women. Women don't want to spend, really, they don't want to spend all their lives out tilling fields and doing that kind of hard work. They would like that burden to, they'd like to be relieved of that burden. So I think we need to look at ways of improving labor productivity. And one way of doing that is consolidation of farms. It's happening all over the world. It's not something we can do much about. It's we can complain about it, but it's happening. It's happening in Asia, right? So farm sizes in Asia are now getting larger because urbanization took place a little earlier in Asia than it has in Africa. In Africa, farm sizes are still getting smaller, all right, on average. And that's because we haven't hit that turning point. The green or the rainbow revolution has not reached most of Africa. We haven't improved productivity levels to the point where we can release labor and to, find creative opportunities to work in cities, to work in services, to work in industries, tourism, whatever else. Okay, we're still on that pathway, but it's an inevitable pathway. It's never really reversed. The only time it's ever reversed was very temporarily when there was a big shock in the Asian crisis, 2008. A lot of folks who'd come to the cities to work actually went back to the rural areas, but within a couple of years, they're all back in the cities again. So it's a trend, and I expect to see farms get larger and larger. Now, it's sort of a different question about very large scale farms. And although I didn't talk about it in any detail, it is an important issue because I think many of these, 1,340 deals were done without full transparency. They were done in ways that didn't necessarily adhere to the Sustainable Development Goal on reducing inequality. Okay, it actually took advantage of small-scale producers instead of bringing them in and being part of this change. So a lot happening there. How are we doing for time? We still got 10 minutes, right? Can we finish it at 9:20? Okay, done. Try and speed these up to we still got 11. Wow. Okay. So agricultural sustainability is closely linked with land tenure. How relevant would agrarian reform be? What alternative mechanism is appropriate? Now, this is an age-old point. It comes up almost every year, I'd say, in these discussions about agriculture. Land is one of the factors of production. You think about it, people have their land in the most basic way. They have their land and their labor, and they have the environment around them to manipulate, right? So if you don't have control over that land, you're in a rather, you're in a difficult position. You're at a disadvantage when it comes to deciding on investments. If you have insecurity, and the worst case scenario, of course, is in a conflict zone. okay? And I've seen that often, that people won't even grow food. They won't even plant a crop in a conflict zone because they don't know they'll be back to harvest it. You know, the rebels will come through and harvest it. So why should I plant? Now, that's an extreme case. I have no control over that land at all right? Then you've got something intermediate where some big landowner is there and they will allow you to use part of their land for a share of that. So these are kind of traditional, you know, feudal tenure systems that existed in England, you know, for centuries, and in India and various other parts, and China and various other parts of the world. But, you know, that has clearly fueled you know, inequalities, right? So over time, many countries have decided that the best way to release the power of entrepreneurship and the role of producers is to give them land tenure of some kind. It doesn't even have to be land ownership per se. It's having leases of various kinds. I know Vietnam did this after essentially farmers had no control over land whatsoever. It was all owned by the state. It was all redistributed by the state on a season-to-season basis. Why would you invest in anything other than very short-term extraction if you didn't have a long-term control over that land? So, you know, there's a lot going on, and I think it needs to be supported. I know Ethiopia has gone through a land reform process. Taiwan in China also went through that process. Vietnam, as I mentioned, and it has led to improvements in productivity. A country that I know pretty well, the Philippines, has tried for decades to do this, but it's been a very slow, painful process. Why? Because in a democracy as it is, those folks in power, those folks in the Senate and in the Congress, happen to be the big landowners. Their history, you know, so yes, they will give lip service to it, but they won't rush to carve up their land and make it available to small-scale farmers. So, you know, it's not necessarily the right thing to do to chop it up into small pieces. Actually, you saw what happened in Zimbabwe when we went, you know, rightfully so, moving towards greater ownership of the indigenous people of Zimbabwe. But, you know, if it's done badly, it can have catastrophic effects on production. So land tenure, land reform is an important part of a larger strategy towards improving the food system. So, right, we'll select this one from Jules D. Smith. How can we encourage types of behavioral changes needed? Obesity, changes towards more sustainable diets, fewer processed foods, political changes. You know, I don't know. This one I don't know. How do we move towards behavioral change? All I can say is everything we've done so far doesn't work, right? It's not working. You know, I think behavioral change is not something you can just sort of turn on like a faucet and just introduce it and it changes. I grew up in Australia, and when I was young, I didn't think much about throwing actually they weren't cans, but a bottle out the window. You'll be shocked. But people didn't think about littering and trash back then. It was like a big world. There's space everywhere. No big deal. You know, I mean, people are shocked. You didn't do that. Yeah, I actually did. It just didn't register. You know, it was no big deal. People trashed stuff. It didn't occur to me, you know, that I would be out in the sun all day and I'd come home absolutely red, you know, sunburned. Nowadays, you know, everybody wears a hat. Everybody wears sunscreen. It's so natural to do that. Everybody wears a seatbelt. Behavioral change happens over time. Part of it is, you know, is the school system. And I think, you know, education at all levels has to work towards that. It has to be backed up with policies and legislation. And I think we're really getting to the point where it makes even economic sense, not just like it's good for your health, it's actually good for the economy if some really hard, enforceable rules were put in place to reform the food system, so that it really, in the same way that we're really discouraged to smoke right now, right? We really, you see people smoking and they're kind of hunched in a corner and they feel guilty about the fact that they still need to have a smoke, right? I see it all the time out on the streets here, but not that often actually, because hardly anyone smokes anymore. You know, it wasn't like that 30 years ago, right? And it's not like that in parts of Europe today. So I think a lot can be done with education, with behavioral change, with taxes, with incentives and so on, but it's going to be a long haul. I think it's going to be a long haul. Okay. From sustainable development point of view, how much meat should we be eating? Insects as protein. I get insects. I never do enough research to be able to have a great answer for the insect question. You know, everything should be literally on the table. If I've eaten insects in different parts of the world, it's a part of the diet. It's never really excited me, I have to say. If it's deep fried and got a lot of spice in it and you have it with a really great cold beer, I can handle it. But it's not something I would look forward to after a hard day's work going home. So, but on a serious level, you know, I think there's an increasing amount of work going into looking at alternative foods, alternative sources of protein and nutrition. Insects, of course, are ubiquitous. And I think there are various kinds of ocean-based products that might also have potential as unusual alternative sources of nutrient. How much meat would we consume? I think, is that your recommendation?
I don't eat meat, but it sounds like a good figure.
So according to Shiv, I don't think I could live on that. I think it's probably, what we desperately need are guidelines, science-based, evidence-based guidelines on what we should be eating. Now, you can ignore the guidelines if you like, but we have this. It's quite well developed in the United States. It's well developed in Europe, but it's not that well developed in other parts of the world. And a lot of the food items are not that relevant to other parts of the world. So one of the proposals that I've been pushing for some time is that we work with countries to try to identify what is the most appropriate mix of products that could come onto a plate, thinking of the plate as a source of, or a bowl, as a source of good nutrition. And I think it's not, it's not just about health, it's also about environment. So a healthy and sustainable diet, a healthy diet from sustainable production is what we should be looking for. The one I go by, and I'm not a vegetarian, but I like vegetarian food, but is keep, if you think of it in terms of a plate, a small amount of lean meat, preferably not red, surrounded by as many different colors as possible. Okay, a very colorful plate of food with a small amount of protein in the middle. And that protein could be tofu or some other source. It could be fish, it could be meat, but do it that way. Remember, small amount of meat, and then a small amount of protein, and then all these other goodies, the green, the orange, golden rice, you name it. It's all there around in a circle. So there you got your rainbow plate, right, for the rainbow revolution. Okay, it's 9:20 here in New York, so I'm sure there's some great, and I see the next one was on GMO, so I'm glad we're finished. But I'm always open to discussing that offline or with our class here and with any of you bilaterally. So with that, thank you very much. Thanks for joining in from various places, from China, from other parts of the world, and enjoy the rest of your day or night. Thank you.